Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the JMO Podcast. I'm your host, Tayler Michels, and we've got our number one regular back on the show this week. That's Jason Mitchell. We're talking late summer walleye patterns, also detailed tips and strategy, how to catch more walleyes this time of year utilizing your electronics to the fullest. There's a lot to enjoy and a lot to learn on this week's podcast. Well, Jason Mitchell, we got you back on. It's really great when we have a chance to settle down and take the time to do more of these podcasts. That being said, maybe do a little bit of recap. It's mid-August right now. What are some of the things that have been going on lately for you?
We've been doing some fishing on Devil's Lake. We were on Fort Peck recently. We've been on Lake Sakakawea and just kind of making our rounds. I mean, predominantly we've been fishing big water, especially on the walleye stuff. And then we've been doing a little bit of bass stuff too. But it's really a tremendous time of the year. I mean, people talk about the dog days of summer, but for a lot of people, say if you have a couple of young kids, you want to get out into fishing. You look at some of the small lakes and the panfish opportunities and the bass fishing opportunities. It's really an easy time of the year just to go out and catch fish. You look at the bigger lakes, whether it's Lake Oahe, Devil's Lake. You can go out and just catch fish. And sometimes catching or finding the bigger fish could be a struggle. But as far as just pulling up to a point and just getting a rod to bend over and getting a bite and catching a few fish for dinner, I've often felt that August is a prime time to to catch a lot of fish. I mean, it's usually nice, stable weather, and kids aren't back in school yet. So, I mean, this is the time of year where we do a lot of fishing.
And, you and I, we spent some time on the road together. We've talked about this in private. This is kind of a weird year with this COVID, and it's been probably one of the longest stretches that you've gone in quite a while in your TV career that you haven't gone to Canada over the course of this summer. How has that been for you, not being able to go to Canada, but yet being able to maybe capitalize on some local bites that you normally miss?
Yeah, I mean, we miss going up to Canada. I mean, I really, last couple of years, I've really enjoyed taking my kids up there, and you get up there and it's like traveling back in time. The water temps might be, pushing 80 degrees back home, and you go, in some of those places up into Canada, and and obviously there's, stupid easy fishing, and then the water temps are 65 degrees, and you're catching fish the same way you were in June back home, but you adjust, so we can't do that this year. Well, we fish other places, we do other things, and the show goes on, but yeah, I mean, it's, I think from a long-term perspective, looking at the fishing industry as a whole, the COVID-19 thing might be the best thing that's ever happened to the fishing industry in many, many years, because more people are getting out fishing. I used to get all kinds of messages, and I still get all kinds of messages, where people have a lot of technical questions, or they want to know where a specific point is on Devil's Lake, or they want to know, how deep, to fish, or they want to know how to run lead core, or really technical type questions. And this year I'm getting all kinds of questions where people they want to know how to back a boat in the water. I'm not kidding. I mean, just really basic, simple things that if you've been fishing a long time, you just kind of overlook. And that tells me there's a lot of new people getting into it. A lot of people that might have gotten away from fishing that are getting back into it, because fishing is a very wholesome, safe activity that's just good for people. And so for a lot of families, for example, a lot of kids' activities have been slowed down, dramatically. A lot of sport stuff has been slowed down. A lot of things that maybe used to tie up vacations, people aren't doing that right now, and they're reconnecting with the outdoors, and I think that's a great thing. I think the outdoors are good for people. There's a lot of people that are very against hunting. There's a fewer amount of people that are even against fishing, and I think what's missed is that the outdoors, that connection to the outdoors, it's very therapeutic. It's very good for people. It's not about killing a deer or catching a big fish all the time. It's just reconnecting with nature and unplugging, and that's good for people. And so I think the more people are doing that, the better. I think the world would be a lot better place if more people fished and fewer riots. That's for sure. So.
And, getting into some of the fishing, as you look across the Midwest right now, maybe keep it specific to the time of year. We're in the middle of August, and maybe specific to the species of walleye. What are some of the prominent bites going on across the different bodies of water in the Midwest?
Well, by and large, there's a lot of deep patterns or deeper patterns. I mean, I think that's a general thumb. Obviously, there's still some shallow stuff, especially in flooded timber and in weeds and stuff where you have good green weeds and you've got good water circulation. When we've seen, some of the high water situations, whether it's on a place like Lake Sakakawea or Devil's Lake, we'd see those shallow patterns, whether the fish are way back up in the bays and on Sakakawea or way up in the shallow sticks and weeds and on Devil's Lake, we'd see that shallow stuff go right through the summer. And, you know, Devil's Lake has, been, kind of plateaued. I mean, it's actually dropped a little bit from the high. And, the lake's fishing a lot differently than when the water was coming up a lot each year. And so we're seeing a lot more deeper stuff. And, we've seen some deep stuff out on Sakakawea too. Deep being, maybe an average of 18 to maybe all the way out to 33, 34 feet of water. And a lot of places that we're going right now, it just seems like you can't go wrong, if you're just fishing that prominent structure, just deep rock structure, especially on Devil's Lake. If you find good rocks, good boulders, rock, and just a hard bottom between 15 and 25 feet of water, we're typically catching fish on those locations.
And, if you were to maybe pick them apart a little bit, I mean, what are some of the most popular methods of fishing and some of the nuance to that?
Well, it depends on the size of the spot. Really small spots that are maybe, say, the size of a three-car garage, or smaller, they obviously don't set up well for trolling crankbaits. But at the same time, if you have a big, long contour that's a quarter of a mile wide, or a quarter of a mile long, or even longer in some cases, and you've got all these little rock spots and little fingers and stuff sticking off that hold fish, and the fish are scattered throughout that, well, then that would be a perfect type of location to troll crankbaits. And so it depends on the size of the spot and how the spot's, the spot will a lot of times dictate the presentation. And so if it's, say, a 50-yard spot, it might be a great candidate for bottom bulgers. If you have to scoot around and try to find the fish on a piece of structure that's you've got narrowed down to, say, a 200-yard stretch or a 300-yard stretch, bottom bulgers might be a great tool. If it's a spot on the spot where you're looking at something the size of a quarter of an acre or smaller, and you're marking fish right below the boat, well, then it might be a vertical bite where you're vertically jigging. A lot of people are using jigging wraps, puppet minnows, Johnny darters, new Selmo rail shad, something that's a lot more precise. And so it just depends on the size of the location, how the fish are set up. If the fish are stacked up on a small spot, you want to spend as much time on that spot as you can. If the fish are spread out and scattered, you need to be able to cover some water and move through the spot to contact fish. And so it just kind of depends on the spot and how they're set up. But I would say jigs, bottom bouncers, and crankbaits are probably the three most prominent patterns you're going to see right now.
And when you go out each day on the landing, I mean, with fish spread out, and every day is different. That's true probably all times of the year, where day to day it's weather this or wind changes direction that, and even at the boat landing you can have a really good day and think that you had the pattern nailed, right? And then you talk to somebody at the boat landing and they maybe outfished you with a totally different pattern. It's just, when things are good, things are really good for everybody. What does your rod locker and tackle box look like when you're heading out there? I mean, you go out there with absolutely everything in your arsenal this time of year because you just don't know, or are you pretty positive when you go out from yesterday's information?
Well, it can change a lot. And the beauty is, and thank goodness for this, that all the fish aren't doing the same thing. Otherwise, everybody's doing the same thing on the same spot. And so, there's a lot of different patterns happening at one time on a lot of large, really good walleye fisheries. Not all the fish are doing the same thing. And a lot of times you said kind of flexible. I know, like on Sakakawea in particular, and Oahe, it seems like, it's here today, gone tomorrow. You catch them really good in one spot, one day doing one thing, and you just can't repeat it the next day. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's just there's so much forage that these fish, the windows where these fish actively feed are narrow, or if the forage is moving around so much that, you just get, you have a good day, then you go back to the next day and you get it in your head, and it's really hard to react, but, a lot of times you have to just kind of fish each day new, and be flexible. And there's things that are pretty flexible. I mean, I'd rather change location typically than really worry about changing my presentation, in the sense that You know, a lot of times on big bodies of water, like say Devil's Lake or Lake Sakakawea, you know, you're going to catch those fish with a variety of different things if the fish are there and if the fish are on. And if they're not there, you can change a lot of stuff in your tackle box, and in you know the results the same. You know, nothing. And so I think the big thing right now is really trusting your electronics, using your electronics to the utmost capability, getting good at reading your electronics, and then that way you can avoid a lot of dead water.
Your philosophy on, having confidence in a method or a depth, and changing spots before, covering water, choosing to cover water versus, working hard over marks, or turning around and giving them a different look or whatever it is, and really grinding out a spot until it works. Is that something that you developed over your guiding days, or is that just, a rule of thumb in fishing? Because, when I go out, sometimes I'll fish memories just like everybody else. And I got spots that I have confidence in, and I have confidence in them with certain methods. And even if they don't bite as good that day, I'll sit and grind that spot out and beat my head against the wall. How did you really come up with some of that, philosophy as far as, covering water and moving to a different area or spot before worrying about changing presentation this time of year?
Well, that's really the $1,000 question, in the sense that there's no right or wrong, and we all make mistakes, on the water. In the sense that if you go back to where you caught fish and you catch a few fish and you're still marking fish, there's a lot to be said for having some patience and figuring out what the bite is, and just waiting for those fish to open up. I mean, more often than not, that's a really good, solid philosophy if you're on fish, or a good strategy, if you will. And then we've all been burned too, where we go back to where we caught fish and the fish aren't there. It's a lot different day. It's tougher. You're catching one or two fish or no fish. You're still marking fish, and you spend way too much time there, and you should have just left and went somewhere else and tried other things. And so that's kind of the two sides of the coin. And if you fish a lot, you're on the wrong side of that coin, more times than you wish. But as a general thumb, if you go out and catch fish on a particular spot on a particular day, and you go out there the next day and the conditions are the same, say the wind's the same direction, the temperature, everything's the same, and you're still marking fish, and you've got enough clues where the fish are still there. A lot of times I'll slow down and grind it out. And it's kind of a deal where you fish where there's fish. And there's an old saying, you don't leave fish to find fish. But at the same time, you get out there and everything's different, everything's changed, and you're not marking fish, you're not seeing fish, and the day is different. Maybe the wind's a different direction, maybe it's hotter, it's colder, maybe it went from being cloudy to high skies and bright sun. Well, then a lot of times I'll have to make some adjustments. And sometimes they're incremental adjustments where you fish the same spot, but you slide out deeper. Maybe you slide in shallower. Maybe you fish faster and you just try to cover a bigger swath or a bigger area in that general area to see if the fish shifted. Maybe they moved a eighth of a mile or a quarter of a mile, And so, that's, typically what I'll start doing. And then if I'm still beating my head against the wall, then you just have to almost reset, the day, and you just start fishing fresh and just, combing through new spots. But, working fish that have already been found is a completely different strategy or different mentality than trying to find fish. When we're trying to find fish, we're just trying to eliminate as much water as we can. And no doubt, when you move too aggressively and too quickly, you probably miss some fish. But if there's a big school of fish somewhere, all you need is one or two to slow you down. Say you go through an area and say you're running a bottom bouncer and a leech, just a plain snell leech, which is a very deadly setup this time of the year. If you can find good leeches, they're very effective. And say you hit 4 or 5 points and you're between 15 and 20 feet of water, you're not marking nothing, you haven't had any bites or whatever, you need to make a big change. And I'm talking a big change. Maybe you got to go deeper, maybe you got to go shallower, maybe you got to run 3 or 4 miles to a different part of the lake. But in my mind, if you haven't seen nothing, if you haven't had any activity, just switching to a different spinner, a different color, maybe switching from a leech to a crawler, those aren't the difference makers in my mind if there's no fish there. And so the biggest thing is finding fish. Once you find fish, then you can put your head down and try different things where you'll find, one day an orange spinner, a green spinner with a half crawler, just for whatever reason, The front rod holders are the rods catching fish, the back rod holders aren't. I mean, you'll find little nuances and things that just develop through that day, but that only happens when you're on fish. And so the big thing is, make sure that you're on fish before you put your head down.
And you kind of already alluded to it, so but we'll dive into that talking about electronics and finding fish. This time of year, with electronics, in your opinion, being that top thing, that's that number one tool in your toolbox, if you will. What all are you reading on your electronics to tell you that you're in productive water and that you're doing the right thing?
Well, there's a lot of things, and it depends on the body of water that you're on and the forage base. When you're, fishing, say, prominent structure, which is really a big thing come, mid to late summer, just your big points, big sunken reefs, your big sunken islands, big long points that run way out into the, main bays or out in the deep channels on the lake. Those spots, a lot of times load up with fish. And sometimes, you'll mark forage, but, in a lot of cases, you'll mark forage in a lot of different places, but where are the fish and where are the aggressive fish? And so, trust your electronics. I mean, you're also going to find on any body of water, you're just going to find dead water for whatever reason. The activity isn't there. And so you definitely want to move through those areas and spend as little time possible in those areas. Move through work yourself out of those dead zones where there's just nothing happening. So that way you can settle down where there's some signs of life. What we often say when we're looking for fish. And you're trying to mark bait fish, and a lot of times other fish will kind of slow you down and stop you too, in the sense that say you're in a bay and you hit, say, 4 or 5 points in a shoreline and the wind's coming in, and maybe the water temperature is really warming up, and and you're just not seeing much, and then you go over, maybe instead of going way back in the bay, you go out to the mouth of the bay and some of the secondary points, and there's just some activity there. You start to maybe catch a catfish, maybe catch a drum, maybe catch a walleye, whatever. But there's some signs of life, and a lot of times different fish species will travel in the same areas because they're all looking for the same things. And and there might be nuances to that. Maybe the smallmouth bass have taken over one part of a point or a rock pile, and maybe if you go up on the shoreline and go up a little shallower, maybe you start running into drum or catfish or whatever. But you'll just see these activity develop in certain patterns, whether it's the secondary points in the mouth of a bay, or maybe it's a main primary structure along the old river channel, whatever it is. If you're on a reservoir, for example, and that can kind of slow you down and give you a few clues too. But thing about walleyes, if you're in water deeper than 12 feet, you're typically going to see them if they're below you. If they're below the boat, you're typically going to see them. And so it's really a matter of trusting electronics. The biggest thing in my mind is discerning the size of the fish and discerning, and being able to figure out what kind of fish they are. In the sense that, a lot of times smallmouth, for example, and some other fish species, they'll show up differently on the screen than how a walleye will. Walleyes have their own look. And like when we get over into northern Minnesota, for example, and we've even seen it down on Lake Oahe, is that sometimes you come off the end of a point, and you get right off the tip of it, and you're in 34 feet of water, and you're seeing all these big marks, and well, they're whitefish, they might not be walleyes. And so as a rule of thumb, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is, in the sense that if you're going along and, and you see 15 big arcs in a ball, usually walleyes just don't seem to set up that way. If it looks too good to be true, it usually is. In the sense that a lot of times what I find is that walleyes will kind of, there'll be some space between them. You'll see one fish, then you maybe go 10, 15 feet, and then you'll see another fish, and they kind of spread out, and they come across the screen one at a time. If you start seeing fish where they come across the screen 5 fish at a time, 10 fish at a time, as a general thumb, what I found is that usually they're not walleyes. And so a lot of times walleyes will come across the screen 1 fish at a time. And if they're bigger fish, obviously it depends on your zoom settings and your electronics, but your bigger fish are just going to have a lot thicker mark. It isn't the length of the mark that determines how big the fish is. The length of the mark is just determined by how long the fish is underneath the boat. Okay, the longer the fish is underneath the boat, if you're going slow, for example, and say the fish is swimming the same direction, that fish might be underneath for a long time. If you spot lock, for example, if you're anchored and the fish is just sitting right below the boat, that fish might look like it's 10 feet long on your screen. Okay, but the thickness of the mark, and so like on the Lowrances that we're using, if you get a really good fish, you'll see that yellow, you'll see that orange in the middle of the mark, and you'll see that yellow in the middle of the mark, where that thicker, taller fish just makes a lot better signal. And so that's how the easiest way to determine the size of the fish. And obviously that's not exact. I'm talking about maybe being able to differentiate between a 15 to 17 inch fish and a 25 inch fish. Those two extremes, that extreme is you're going to be able to see the difference on your electronics. A couple other things, is obviously you want to turn your sensitivity up where you can see what's below you, but if you have it too high, you're obviously going to get a cluttered screen. But really, what's really important too is match the scroll speed to the boat speed. And so when you're running down the lake and say you're running 30 miles an hour and you're running along, like places like the slides or some of the bluffs, and you're just trying to, find some areas where you can mark bait fish, because you can mark bait fish at really high speeds, and sometimes you can mark walleyes at high speeds too, especially if they're up off the bottom. Then you want to have a fast scroll speed when you're moving through spots pretty quickly, really trying to eliminate water. And at the other end of the spectrum, when you're slowing down and say you're moving through an area with a live bait rig or a bottom bouncer, and you're going along at a mile an hour, slow your scroll speed down, and it just seems like you get a lot better picture of what's happening. That's half of it, just setting up your electronics so that way you get a good picture, so that way it's easier to interpret. And some of it's speed. I mean, I find that I mark fish way better if I come up and down the structure and just kind of zigzag over it, come up and come down, and I get better separation when those fish are, especially when those fish are on a break line. I can get them, separate from the bottom. But it's amazing. Sometimes I'll mark a big fish sliding down the structure. I'll hit a icon, and I'll try to spin around and come back. And as soon as I come back, just coming from a different angle, I can't see that fish. And so going up and down is something you get the best separation as far as being able to find fish on sharper breaking structure. Then side imaging, side scan's been a really important tool too. I mean, I use that a lot. And, now we've even got the live scope and some of that stuff where we can point the transducer and, kind of see a live action, as far as seeing where fish are to the side of the boat. But side scan and side imaging, that's something that we get a lot of questions on. And I guess as a rule of thumb, start out with your range set low. And what I mean by that is, just don't worry about what's off to the side of the boat 100 feet. You have to be really experienced, and you have to have a pretty large unit with a big screen to even come close to interpreting what's on side imaging, say 100 feet from the side of the boat. Just worry about what's 20 to 30 feet from the side of the boat starting out. And when you're running at those lower ranges closer to the boat, set your settings on the highest kilohertz that you can do on that specific unit. And those higher kilohertz settings, they'll give you a lot better resolution, a lot sharper picture close to the boat. Now, once you get more experienced and you want to shoot further away from the boat, especially over deeper water, you can, then you want to lower it down. You want to use a lower kilohertz settings, because you're going to get a better picture, say 60, 70, 80 feet from the boat. But what I find is that for marking fish, marking walleyes in particular, to mark fish and get that good picture, you want to lower your range and increase the kilohertz. And that's how you get that better resolution for marking fish. What the bigger ranges really work well at with the lower kilohertz setting is if you want to make a swath through an area and find, like, say, some rock piles or maybe laydowns, you can really read the structure, especially like on Devil's Lake. You get a lot of these deep fish where if you can find rock piles or some type of structure, some type of character, in that 30 to 40 foot, 45 foot range, you're going to find walleyes. And some of those spots are kind of on the old shoreline, but if you can find anything that's not on the old shoreline, that's a magnet. And the easiest way to find that is to increase your range and, and do that. But, in fish, a lot of times, when you're going along, if you turn the boat a lot when you're using side imaging, your picture really gets distorted. It's really difficult to interpret fish. So it's more important to go in a straight line when you're using your side scan or side imaging. But when you see fish, they'll almost look like they'll almost look like rice. Where you just see these little white, brighter specks that are elongated, that are longer, and that shape can get distorted too, depending on the angle of the fish and how your transducer comes by. But what I always tell people is go by something that you know. Say, especially like on Lake Sakakawea, say you put in at the ramp and you remember that right off the shoreline there was a rock point that came out, and you still have a mental picture of what some of that stuff looked like. Drive by with your side imaging, so that way you can see it on your side imaging, so that way uh, you've got a reference. Or even drive by docks that are in the water. As far as being able to figure out your angle, because the next step is, once you figure out what fish look like and what that entails, is when you do see a nice fish on your side scan or side imaging, being able to cast to it. A lot of times it's an angle back behind the boat, anywhere from 15 to 30-degree angle behind the boat, and being able to interpret that angle, you have to drive by something so that you can kind of get an orientation, if that makes any sense. And so a lot of times in trying to teach yourself how to really take your side scan or side imaging capabilities to another level, is drive by, even if it's trees in the water, just something that you have a visual reference. So then that way, as you drive by it with the side imaging, you'll see it above the water, you'll have that reference, and you'll be able to mark where it is. And when you see it on the side imaging, look back and see, look at the angle. And it's behind the boat. I mean, a lot of times by the time you see something on side imaging and it's in the middle of the screen or at the bottom of the screen, it's way behind the boat, and obviously to the side. And so make sure you really get in tune to watching what's happening at the top of the screen, because that's what's closest to the boat. That's what you just drove over. And if you have any chance of casting towards that fish, that's important. But yeah, I mean, it's a really useful tool that can, it takes time to to really get good at it, like anything does. But you get some confidence in it, and it can definitely be a game changer.
The JMO Podcast is sponsored by Long Haul Trucking. Long Haul's always looking for more skilled professional CDL drivers to join their team. They're a people-first company, and it shows. Their employee-owned, asset-based fleet of over 350 Conestogas is among industry leaders in pay and benefits geared towards long-term success and growth for company drivers and owner-operators. If you're a professional driver or a company that wants to ship product with the best in the business, get a hold of Long Haul at 1-800-255-5153 or find them online at longhaultrucking.com. Long Haul, running on the power of promises kept. You just covered a lot of ground on that, and I love it. That's great information. Another thing that I hear on here a lot, referenced in different capacities, is reading the mood of the fish. If you've already got, say, 10 good spots on a known body of water, it's your home body of water. You got 10 spots that you've got great memories on. You've got a milk run kind of set up, and maybe there's some fish on all of them. But going over them and seeing that those fish are maybe laid down on the bottom, or getting into an area and seeing that those fish are raised up, maybe, they're feeding or whatever it is. What are you looking for out of spots where you are marking fish, but you're trying to read the mood of the fish, and maybe how does that play into how you decide your methods of fishing, or just reading the mood of the fish?
Well, I think the biggest thing across the board is that if fish are elevated up off the bottom a little bit, especially if there's some separation between the bottom and the fish. I mean, typically those are your easiest fish to catch. And you'll see it a lot, like when we've seen it anywhere from Fort Peck to northern Minnesota lakes, where this time of year when fish are, they're chasing a cool water pelagic bait fish, whether it's smelts, ciscos, something along those lines. And I think what happens is those fish slide out over that deeper water and they feed, and when they're out over that deeper water chasing that suspended school of bait fish, those fish can be anywhere, okay? But what the constant factor is, when those fish get done eating, they'll slide up onto a point just to rest. And so a lot of times, people have it in their heads where fish are deep and they're inactive and they're not feeding, and they slide up onto the point, or they slide up onto the structure to eat. And I think it's the exact opposite on a lot of these big lakes and reservoirs that have that cool water bait fish population, where these fish slide deep and out over open water to eat, and they slide up onto the point, and a lot of times they might even slide a little shallower just to warm up and digest their last meal. And so say you have a big prominent point sticking out, next to or close to the old river channel on a place like Lake Sakakawea, and those fish are sliding out, they're chasing smelt around. Maybe they're pushing the smelt against some of those sharp breaks to try to pin them down. And then once they stuff themselves, then they'll slide up onto a prominent point, and they just lay there. And it's almost like, I've seen some underwater footage of it where these walleyes just lay on a spot, almost like where their bottom fins can just touch the rock, and they just lay there. They digest their last meal. Maybe the sun can hit them, hit them a little bit on the back and warm up a little bit. And then when they get done digesting, then they lift up off the bottom, and then they start looking again, and they start getting ready to slide out. And so you see this a lot on some of these prominent structure locations where you'll see fish and they're right next to the bottom and they're glued to the bottom, and it's just you're pulling your hair out trying to get bit. Maybe on a good spot you might get a bite an hour, and it's just really kind of a grind of a bite, and then it's like a light switch goes on where those same fish, all of a sudden you start to see them come up off the bottom. All of a sudden they're 1 foot off the bottom, they're 3 feet off the bottom, and they're starting to separate from the bottom a lot more. Then you might have an hour window where you catch 8 fish, and that's pretty common this time of the year. And so if the fish are separated from the bottom, that's usually your easier fish to catch. And the other thing too is sometimes we find fish shallower, even like 8 feet of water, 10 feet of water, 12 feet of water. And what I find is if you mark fish and you have a little bit of separation, but they're a little bit off the bottom, and they let you drive right over the top of them without sliding on you, that's a aggressive fish. It seems like when fish, especially when the water warms up, and this is just my theory just from fishing, but it seems like when the water warms up and the fish are aggressive, those fish are so aggressive that they're just not boat shy anymore. I mean, you can come rumbling over the top of those fish with a big motor, big prop turning, and catch them right below the boat. In fact, sometimes, that prop turning, that big stainless steel prop turning can actually be almost like an attractor, where you'll just catch fish right below the boat, 5 feet of water, 8 feet of water, 12 feet of water, and they stay there. They don't slide off on you. And obviously, those are the most aggressive fish you're ever going to find. But if the fish are close to the bottom or right on the bottom, glued to the bottom, there's no separation, or if you see where, like when fish slide off of the boat, sometimes what will happen is the mark will look almost like a slash, where it'll, instead of being a horizontal mark, it'll be more of a vertical slash type mark. And sometimes when you're seeing that a lot, it's almost like the fish are bumping away from the boat. Because there's other times where you go over the top of them, and even 8-10 feet of water, especially if the water's clear, they just won't let you get away with that. And that gives you a clue, in the sense that maybe you have to cast, maybe you have to let out more line behind the boat and zigzag the boat more. But yeah, I mean, typically when you see fish, you have separation and they're staying right below the boat, those are the easy ones.
I want to stay on this electronics topic, but maybe shift a little bit to some of the structure this time of year where it's really hard to mark fish, like bigger boulders, where the fish might be hiding in them, or maybe there's some weed bites. It's hard to always see fish, when they're in the weeds. What are you looking for sometimes when you're reading the structure on your electronics?
Well, I think you have to, understand your electronics good enough to realize situations where you won't mark fish. Okay. And so say if you're on a big sand point that comes out in 15, 20 feet of water, and it just kind of tapers off nice and it drops off and it's pretty clean. And there's a little bit of rock on it, but the rocks are maybe the size of a bowling ball. On locations like that, if the fish are there, you're going to mark them. At the same time, say if you have a bunch of rocks and say they're 4 feet, 3 feet in diameter, maybe there's a couple of laydowns in it, and it's just really snaggy and difficult to fish. You have to realize that in that type of location, you're not always going to see them. And so those locations where you're not always going to see the fish, at the end of the day, you just have to stop and slow down and fish those spots to make sure to eliminate that as an option. And so, yeah, I mean, there's situations where you're not going to mark fish well. Big boulders where fish can lay in the crevices, and any type of a bottom that has a blind spot where you can imagine your cone angle on your electronics, it shoots down almost like a flashlight beam. So the deeper you are, the bigger the area that you're covering. And the 19-degree transducer, is a general thumb, you're about a third of the depth. Okay, and so if you're in, say, 21, 22 feet of water, your cone angle is going to be roughly 6.5 to 7.5 foot across. Okay, now within that cone angle, say you have a couple of big boulders that are, say, 2 to 3 feet high, and you've got a fish that's a foot off the bottom, that fish just gets lost in the bottom. Okay, that fish has to be basically higher than than the biggest boulder below the boat in order to separate from the bottom. And so that's the other thing, is if you do see separation in that type of location, those fish might be 3 feet off the bottom, 4 feet off the bottom, in order to get separation in big boulders. And, typically those are, aggressive fish. But, if a fish is only a foot and a half off the bottom, 2 foot off the bottom, it's got a 2 foot high boulder to the right and a 3 foot high boulder to the left, you're not always going to see those fish. Now, sometimes they'll show up on side imaging, but it can be a lot harder to find those fish through electronics. And so that's a deal where you just have to fish it to know, to make sure. But, that's, and obviously, it's not just marking fish, but the thing about those types of locations is that, a lot of times you have to have your angle right as far as below the boat, and you have to have the right amount of lead or weight below the boat, whether you're using whether it's a jigging wrap, or whether it's a rail shad, or whether it's a bottom bounce, whether it's just a traditional jig and a minnow, or, maybe a big egg sinker and a 3 foot snell and a chub, or whatever it is. You have to fish a lot more precisely and a lot more slow, and get really vertical over the tops of those locations, so you can kind of feel your way through them. But, a lot of times those types of locations aren't big. It's not like you're going to find 300 yards of boulders like that. A lot of times these spots are a spot on the spot, where it might be, say, off the side of a point or the top of a point, and you might have a 15-yard stretch where you have these really big boulders, and that's kind of the big fish spot on that entire stretch. You might catch fish all over that location for 100 yards, but that spot is where the big fish are laying. And, and something like that, it gets a lot more precise, a lot more surgical, where you're just fishing right below the boat, and the spots are typically pretty small.
Man, with all this technology that we talk about nowadays, if you could take the Lowrance units that you have in your boats now and go back and put them into your first guide boat, what would be some of the big eye-opening things you think to your former self with the electronics we have nowadays?
Well, I think obviously, the screens are a lot bigger today than what we had in the past. And so then when you've got a bigger screen to look at, it's a bigger picture. It's like watching a TV. It's like watching a football game on TV on say a 70-inch plasma screen versus the 13-inch black and white TV that we used to have. It's the same football game. It's just that it's a lot easier to see everything, and watch everything. But I wouldn't discount some of the older electronics. My goodness, we've had, chances are, if you have a unit in your boat that's 20 years old, it'll show you what you need to see. But it's just that when you get into some of the newer stuff and some of the bigger stuff, it's just easier. It's easier to interpret. You might get better high-speed readings, maybe a little bit better separation. But I tell you what, if you are really in tune to your electronics, and you spend a lot of time on the water, and you know what you're looking at, so when you go over a fish, you know it, and you know what it looks like. I don't care if it's a flasher. I don't care if it's a old Humminbird Super 60. That's what's important, is just being able to interpret what you see. Okay. And so the reality is that if somebody fishes a lot and they're really, really familiar and comfortable with their electronics, they're going to be way better. They're going to know more with a 20-year-old unit than somebody that doesn't ever get to fish and what they've got brand new in their boat today. Okay. And so someone is just putting the time in knowing what you're looking at, and being able to interpret that. Some units are not going to show you a nice mark. They're just going to show you a blob. Okay. But if you know what to look for, and you know what that blob means when you go over it, that's all you need to know. And so so a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, you don't necessarily have to run out and buy a brand new unit. Just make sure that you can interpret whatever unit that you have on your boat and try to use it to the fullest capacity. Obviously, if there's one thing that's really gotten better in the last, say, 5 years, it's side imaging or side scanning compared to what we first had when it first came out. It was okay, but it's really gotten a lot better. And even like with some of the updates, you can go online. Even if you have a 3-year-old unit, like say a Lowrance carbon unit, you can get updates and just get Wi-Fi access and update some of the software, and you're going to get a lot better picture. And just get a lot easier to interpret. But and then obviously the map chips. The map chips have gotten better and better. That's probably something that's been around for 15 years now. But good mapping on a lot of lakes is a big deal. That's as important as what your sonar is showing you in a lot of cases.
What would you say is the best bang for your buck right now with electronics in a boat? Is it is it just still just the mapping on a lot of bodies of water, or do you think that some of this newer side scan, structure scan stuff, you can get a lot for $500-600 at Shields nowadays, and I know that's a lot of money, but for what people are paying for boats nowadays, people are buying electronics. I mean, what would you say is kind of money best spent right now?
Well, it just depends on what you're looking for. I mean, if you have an older boat and you've got, say, a unit that doesn't have mapping, for example, it's got GPS, but it doesn't have mapping. And back in the day, I mean, we had to have separate units. I mean, we'd have a sonar unit, then we'd have a GPS unit next to it, and that wasn't that many years ago, really. But, say you have an older unit and say it's got GPS, but it doesn't have the mapping, even, Lawrence sells a lot of just like the Elite 5s and Elite 7s where you just split the screen, have half screen GPS map, half screen sonar. I mean, that, can go a long ways for just having that mapping, or use your old unit for sonar and then buy a new unit, just have full screen mapping. So the mapping, once you go to that, you'll never go back. I mean, it is a big, big advantage, having a good map of the water that you're fishing, a contour map. But, I run HDS 12s on one boat. I run HDS 16s on another boat. It just, and the biggest thing with the size is that, you know, an HDS 9 is going to do the same thing as an HDS 16. It's just that you have a bigger screen, and so when you start splitting screens, especially if you have, say, side imaging on one area on the screen, then you got traditional sonar on another, then your GPS map on another. It's just a bigger area to look at. And so all you're buying is size in a lot of cases when you go up into some of the bigger units. The smaller units are going to show you and do the same thing. It's harder to interpret. It's harder to use if those pictures, those windows get so small. Say if your GPS map is the size of 2 inches by 2 inches, when you divide up your screen, it's just a lot harder to see what you're looking at. But obviously, touch screens are nice when it's not raining, when you don't have frost, when it's nice out. Just because, again, a touch screen will do the same thing that a non-touch screen does, it's just that it's faster. But with your fingers, as far as how you can go through the settings and do things on your electronics. But the biggest thing is just spending time to interpret what you're seeing. And that's going to be different for every unit. It's going to be different for every person. And it's going to be different on every fishery in every situation. But the more comfortable you can get, the faster you can get, the better. And the biggest thing is just getting fast at avoiding bad situations. It could be something as simple as a temperature gauge. I mean, that's a very important part of your total electronics package, especially early in the year where, say, you go in an area you've been catching fish, you go in the area the next day or a week later, and it's 5 degrees colder and the water's dirtier and the wind's blowing, and all of a sudden, I got to maybe duck out of this wind a little bit. I got to try to find some spots that were protected because where I was catching fish, it's muddy and it's cold. And that in its simplest form, temperature gauge is a big thing. Your mapping can be a big thing in the sense that maybe you catch fish on a secondary point and it's kind of a long, narrow point that juts out into 25 feet of water, and you do really good on that spot. The next day you get out there and you catch a few, but now there's 15 boats on that spot and the fish aren't biting anymore. Okay, where's the next spot closest to this that looks really similar? And you look at it on your map and you look over there like, wow, there's no boats there. I better go check that quick. You drive up it, drive down it, and you mark some fish, and there you go. And that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of where how your electronics can aid you in your fishing. You're just trying to make decisions through the day, and you're going to make the wrong decisions. You're going to make bad decisions, but hopefully, if you can interpret your electronics well and use your electronics well, you can get back on the right track more quickly, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, man. Well, I tell you what, we're doing really good on time for this. So, mid-August right now, walleye fishing. Do you have any nuggets, any closers for us? Is there any updates maybe on Devil's Lake? What are some of the prominent things going on Devil's Lake here, just to close this out?
Well, right now, Devil's Lake, we're seeing that classic, rock pattern develop. If you have a hard bottom, whether it's a road bed, a ditch on a road bed, or just an old shoreline where there's some rock and gravel on it, just hard bottoms. Because Devil's Lake's a big dish bowl, is basically a big slough that got flooded, and so you're not going to find rock everywhere. But there's certain areas where you're going to find some rock, and it seems like if you find rock between 12 and 24, 25 feet of water, those are high percentage spots right now for just going out, just simply catching walleyes. But yeah, and you can't go wrong this time of year focusing on those types of locations. And if you take it up another notch and just not even worrying about fishing spots where you don't mark fish, and if you just drive around, maybe you look at 10 spots, maybe you look at 5 spots, maybe it takes only 3 spots, or maybe it's the first spot, but just, drive around and, spend some time idling around, looking stuff over, and don't fish until you mark fish. That to me is about the most high percentage thing that you can do right now, just to go out and catch fish. And so focus on those rock locations and don't just spend the whole day in the first one that you find. Drive around and don't fish until you mark fish. That to me is just a winning combination right now. I mean, that's kind of what I do. That's my bread and butter right now. Is I don't try to get bogged down where there aren't any fish. Just try to, and a lot of times too, this time of year, don't be afraid to spend a lot of time just driving around and looking. I mean, a lot of times we spend more time driving than we do fishing, because fishing where there's fish is a pretty important part of the puzzle. And so, don't be afraid to drive around, and maybe you drive a mile to get to a spot, and you get there and you drive around and nothing on it. You drive to another spot that's nearby, nothing on it. Well, maybe you got to drive another mile and a half over the other direction and find some other spots. But and sometimes you might drive around an hour, or whatever, and obviously that's not fun. You want to get your line in the water and start catching right away. But if you can have some patience that way, and use your electronics to eliminate where there aren't fish, that goes a long ways right now.
I think that's great, man. I just want to thank you again for taking the time to do this, and I'll let you back at it.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all for following along on another episode of the podcast. Head over to our social medias at Jason Mitchell Outdoors on Instagram or Facebook. If you're following along on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with all your friends.